Sandra Bullock was shaking. The crowd watched. A police officer laughed at her, in front of everyone. But then, Keanu Reeves stepped forward. And what he said, it changed everything. The flashing cameras, the roaring fans, the red carpet, it was supposed to be a night of celebration. Sandra Bullock smiled for the cameras, but inside, her chest was tightening. Her breath caught. Her hands shook. She tried to hide it, like she always did. But this time, someone noticed. A police officer standing nearby chuckled under his breath. Then louder. He mocked her panic, in front of everyone. People laughed. Phones came out. The humiliation began. And just when the world turned away, he stepped forward. Keanu Reeves didn't raise his voice. He didn't make a scene. But what he did next silenced the entire crowd, and changed one man's life forever. This isn't just about a red carpet moment. This is about dignity, courage, and what real strength looks like when the world turns cruel. The private lounge inside the theater was quiet, but Sandra couldn't find peace. She sat on the edge of a velvet sofa, hands clenched in her lap, staring at the floor like it held all the answers she needed. Her chest still felt tight. Her breathing shallow. It wasn't the panic attack that scared her now, it was what came after. Keanu sat beside her, not asking questions. He didn't offer comforting clichés or force her to talk. He just sat there, grounded, present. Sometimes silence was the best support a person could offer, and he understood that better than most. A knock came at the door. Their publicist stepped in, holding her phone tightly, her face pale. "You two need to see this," she said, barely above a whisper. She turned the phone toward them. On the screen, a video played. Shaky footage, clearly from a fan's phone. The cop's smirk. His cruel comment. Sandra's quiet, trembling reply. And then Keanu, firm, calm, unshakable, stepping forward. The clip ended with them walking away. It already had over 2 million views. Sandra blinked. Her face flushed red. This was the last thing she wanted. "I didn't want this," she said. "I just needed some air. Now it's going to become some headline." Keanu leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You didn't do anything wrong," he said. "And you weren't weak. You were honest. There's power in that." She looked at him, eyes full of worry. "Now the focus is on me instead of the film. They're going to make it about drama." Keanu smiled gently. "Let them. The truth will always matter more than the noise." Outside the room, the world was already spinning. Social media had exploded. Hashtags like #RespectSandra and #KeanuProtects were trending. Celebrities were speaking up. Mental health advocates were reposting the clip with messages about dignity and support. But far away from the glamour of the premiere, another scene was unfolding. The police department had identified the officer. Journalists were calling. His name was being dragged across headlines. The department issued a short statement. An investigation had begun. Back in the lounge, Sandra remained silent, absorbing the weight of it all. Keanu took a breath, slow and measured. "You know," he said, "I was once laughed at in a hospital waiting room. I was sitting with someone who was dying, and I couldn't talk. Couldn't move. A nurse thought I was being rude. Called me cold." She turned toward him. "What did you do?" "Nothing. I just stayed quiet. But that night stuck with me. People don't always see what you're carrying. But that doesn't mean it's not heavy." Sandra didn't reply. Her throat tightened, but this time it wasn't panic, it was emotion. "I don't want people to pity me," she said. "They won't," Keanu replied. "They'll understand you better. They'll see themselves in you. And maybe they'll stop laughing at others the way he laughed at you." Another knock. A studio rep poked their head in. "They're ready to start in 15. Sandra nodded. Keanu stood and offered his hand. "We don't have to stay long. Just show up, wave, then we slip out." She took his hand and stood. Outside that door was a world spinning with opinions, headlines, and a viral video neither of them had planned for. But inside that moment, all that mattered was one friend standing beside another. The panic hadn't gone away completely. But now, she didn't have to face it alone. By the time Sandra and Keanu walked onto the stage to greet the audience, the energy in the room had completely shifted. The applause felt louder, but not in the usual celebratory way. It was filled with something else. Respect. Solidarity. Even protection. They smiled, waved, stood side by side under the stage lights. But Keanu noticed the subtle tremor still in Sandra's hand. He gently touched her back as they exited. The crowd didn't know the full story. Not yet. But they felt something had happened. And the outside world, it already knew. By the time the movie credits rolled, the video had reached 10 million views. Clips were everywhere. News sites, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube. Headlines read like shockwaves. Keanu Reeves defends Sandra Bullock after cop mocks her anxiety. Grace under fire. How one quiet moment sparked a global conversation. Even late-night hosts mentioned it, showing the clip on screens behind them. But what surprised Sandra most wasn't the attention, it was the response. People began sharing stories. Strangers across the world wrote about being mocked for panic attacks. A teacher who froze during a staff meeting. A teenager who fainted during an exam. A young mother who had a breakdown at a grocery store. All of them said the same thing: "Thank you for not staying silent." Sandra sat in her kitchen the next morning, scrolling through comments, reading quietly. One from a young girl stood out. "I always thought I was broken. But now I see someone like you go through it too. Thank you for being real." Tears welled up. She closed the screen and sat with the silence. Keanu called that afternoon. He didn't ask how she was. He just said, "I'm on my way." When he arrived, she opened the door and simply said, "It's everywhere." "I know," he said. "Are you okay with that?" "I don't know," she answered. "I didn't plan to become a symbol." He nodded. Sometimes the world chooses its symbols. But that doesn't mean you owe them anything more. She paused. "People are asking me to speak. To give interviews. To go public. Do you want to?" he asked. "No," she said quickly. "But I feel like I should." Keanu sat down across from her. Calm, patient, thoughtful. "Here's the truth. You already said enough. Just by existing. Just by being honest. You don't need to explain your pain to the world." She looked down at the table. Her fingers traced the edge of her mug. "But maybe it's not about explaining. Maybe it's about protecting the next person. The one who won't have someone like you standing beside them when it happens." Keanu smiled, slow and soft. "Then when you speak, speak for them. Not because the world expects it. But because they need to know they're not weak. They're human." Sandra leaned back in her chair, exhaling deeply. Something inside her had shifted. The shame that once clung to her panic was slowly giving way to something else. Strength. Purpose. Outside, the media waited. More cameras. More attention. But this time, Sandra didn't feel like she was hiding. She felt like she was standing. The world had reacted with noise. But underneath that noise was a quiet, growing wave of understanding. And at the center of it stood two people, one who had been mocked for her fear, and one who chose to stand beside her, not with anger, but with unwavering grace. 3 days passed. The headlines slowed down, but the conversations didn't. News channels debated it. Psychologists wrote columns about the importance of emotional safety in public spaces. Hashtags came and went, but the video still kept circling. Sandra stayed home. She turned down interviews. She stayed off the red carpet. But what she couldn't avoid was the message from the police department. The officer, the one who had mocked her, had requested a meeting. Her first reaction was silence. Then confusion. Then anger. She sat in her living room, reading the official statement again. The department had placed the officer on administrative leave. He had apparently watched the footage, faced internal discipline, and now he wanted to meet Sandra and Keanu to apologize in person. Keanu called shortly after. "I got the same message," he said. "You don't have to do it." "I don't know if I want to," she admitted. "I don't even know what I'd say." "You don't have to say anything," Keanu replied. But sometimes, Giving someone a second chance says more than words ever could. Sandra paused. She hated the thought of facing him, of being in the same room with that smug expression again. But a part of her also wondered, what if he truly didn't understand? What if he thought he was being funny, not cruel? What if this moment could teach him something? "I'll do it," she said finally. "But I want you there." "Of course," Keanu said. "I was never going to let you walk into that alone." 2 days later, they met in a quiet conference room inside the department. No cameras. No press. Just Sandra, Keanu, a department official, and the officer. He entered nervously, his hands shaking slightly. Gone was the arrogance. Gone was the smirk. "I'm sorry," he said the moment he sat down. "I've replayed it 100 times, and I hate the man I was in that video." Sandra didn't reply. She watched him carefully. "I thought I was being funny," he continued. "I didn't realize how cruel it sounded. I didn't know anything about you, or panic attacks, or what it's like to be in that moment." Sandra finally spoke. "You didn't have to know anything about me. Just that I was a person asking for space." He looked down. "You're right," he said. "I've started attending training sessions now. On empathy, mental health, communication. It's not mandatory. I wanted to understand." Keanu watched quietly, his hands folded. "I appreciate your apology," Sandra said, her voice calm but steady. "But this isn't about me. It's about every person who's been mocked for their anxiety. Every kid who froze in front of a classroom. Every adult who broke down in a parking lot and got called weak." The officer nodded. "I want to be better. I want to teach better too. I've already volunteered to speak at our academy's next training seminar." Keanu leaned forward. "Just don't make this a one-time thing," he said. "Change isn't what you say in a meeting. It's what you do when no one's watching." The officer nodded again, more seriously this time. As they left the room, Sandra didn't feel triumphant. She didn't feel vindicated. But she felt lighter. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was the beginning of something better. Sometimes, strength doesn't roar. Sometimes it's the quiet decision to face the person who hurt you, and leave them with no excuse to stay the same. The air was cooler when Sandra stepped outside the police department. The city noise felt different. Not quieter, just less important. As she walked beside Keanu, there was no need to speak. Everything had been said in that room. But something new was beginning to stir in both of them. They weren't just reacting anymore. They were thinking about what came next. A car picked them up at the curb. On the ride back, Sandra stared out the window, watching people move through the city like they always had. Some smiling, some rushing, some looking down at their phones, others lost in their own worlds. She thought about the thousands of messages still flooding her inbox. Stories from people she had never met. Men and women describing their own panic attacks, their breakdowns, their shame. All of them saying the same thing. They were tired of pretending they were okay when they weren't. Keanu finally broke the silence. "You know what I keep thinking?" he asked. She turned to him. That moment on the red carpet, it wasn't just about what he said. It was about what people believe. That having money or fame means you're not allowed to feel panic. Or fear. Or anything human. Sandra nodded slowly. And it's not just celebrities. It's everyone. People are ashamed to speak up. Afraid they'll be laughed at. Like I was. They were quiet again. Then Keanu said, "What if we didn't stop here?" Sandra looked at him, surprised. "What do you mean?" "What if we created something? A space. A campaign. Something that helps people talk about these moments. Without fear. Without shame." She smiled a little. "You mean like a project?" "No," he said. "More than that. A movement. Something that reaches the girl sitting in the back of a crowded classroom trying not to cry. Or the dad in the grocery store frozen with anxiety. Or the nurse in the hospital hallway holding it all in." Sandra leaned back, considering it. The idea didn't scare her. It comforted her. They spent the next few weeks building something they called Pause with Kindness. It started with a short video. Just Sandra sitting in a chair, speaking plainly. She didn't wear makeup. She didn't dress up. She didn't script anything. She just looked into the camera and said, "I panicked. I was ashamed. And then I realized I didn't need to be. Because I'm not alone. And neither are you." The video went live on a Tuesday morning. By Tuesday night, it had over 15 million views. Schools started requesting materials. Workplaces asked for posters. Mental health professionals offered to volunteer their time. Celebrities began posting their own stories. And slowly, the shame around panic started to crack. One story, from one red carpet, had turned into something much bigger. Keanu didn't appear in the video. He never needed to. But behind the scenes, he was there for every decision, every phone call, every late-night conversation about whether they were doing the right thing. Sandra once asked him why he stayed so quiet through it all. He just said, "Because this was never about me. I just stood where I was needed." And she realized then that was the difference. Most people want to be seen. But Keanu wanted others to feel seen. Pause with Kindness grew fast, but it wasn't loud. It didn't rely on headlines or hashtags. It moved from person to person, from moment to moment, quietly changing the way people saw themselves and each other. And for Sandra, that quiet mattered more than any standing ovation ever could. Months passed. The premiere was long behind them. The headlines faded, as they always do. The officer had quietly stepped down from public service, but had taken a new path, working with young recruits, talking openly about the mistakes that cost him his badge and his pride. He didn't try to fix his image. He tried to fix himself. That, to Sandra, mattered more. Pause with Kindness had grown into something neither of them had expected. What started as a video turned into workshops, campaigns, live conversations hosted across cities and schools. It became a movement not of celebrities, but of regular people sharing raw truths without fear of judgment. Sandra attended many of them in person. Keanu often stayed behind the scenes, supporting from the edges, showing up when it mattered but never stepping into the spotlight. Sandra sat on a bench one autumn afternoon in Central Park, watching leaves fall like slow confessions from the sky. A young woman sat down beside her, shy, hesitant. "Are you her?" the woman asked. Sandra turned and smiled gently. "I'm someone." The woman's eyes welled with tears. "I watched that video the night I almost gave up. You said, 'I panicked. I was ashamed.' That line, it saved me." Sandra placed a hand over hers. "Thank you for telling me." Moments like these had become frequent. Airports, bookstores, street corners. Not because she was a star, but because she had allowed herself to be seen as human. The armor of perfection was gone, and in its place was a woman willing to say, "I don't always have it together, and that's okay." Later that evening, Sandra called Keanu. She always called him after moments like that. He picked up after one ring, as if he'd been expecting it. "You good?" he asked. "I think so," she said. "That girl in the park, it still catches me off guard, you know? How much one moment can ripple." "Yeah," he said. "But sometimes it only takes one voice to stop a wave from crashing." They talked for a while about nothing and everything, as old friends do. And then they hung up, both smiling in their own corners of the world. That night, Sandra wrote in her journal. She didn't often share her writing, but this time, she would. She planned to read it aloud at the next Pause with Kindness event. She wrote about that night on the red carpet. About the heat of the lights and the coldness of the smirk. About the silence between breaths and the roar of humiliation. And then, she wrote about Keanu. Not about what he said, but about how he stood. Unmoving, unshaken, unafraid to confront cruelty with grace. She wrote, "He didn't speak for applause. He didn't defend me to be a hero. He just reminded everyone watching that stillness can be louder than cruelty. That respect can exist without shouting. That strength is often quiet." She closed the journal with a sigh. That night changed her, not because it exposed her fear, but because it reminded her what real dignity looks like, not flawless, but fearless in its honesty. And maybe that was the point all along. That even in the most humiliating, panic-stricken moment, even when the world points and laughs, One person choosing to stand beside you can rewrite the entire narrative. The red carpet had been rolled away. The noise faded. But one moment had stayed. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was true. And sometimes, the world doesn't need more noise. It just needs one person to step forward and say, enough. This story moved you, then let it do more than just sit in your heart. Share it with someone who needs to hear that they are not weak for feeling overwhelmed. Speak up when someone mocks what they don't understand. And most importantly, be that one person who chooses to stand beside someone instead of watching them fall alone. Because sometimes, the quietest acts of courage spark the loudest change. Subscribe for more stories that remind us all, humanity is still alive, and kindness still matters.